Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for your ears. Imagine a locked chest buried beneath the earth, its iron hinges rusted by centuries, its contents whispered about in secret halls of power. Tonight, you will hear what was hidden inside. This is not entertainment. This is not folklore. This is the kind of truth that makes men disappear. If you continue, you will not leave unchanged. You will feel the weight of shadows pressing in. But once you cross the threshold, there is no turning back. Louisiana, 1889. A year when the world was pretending to march toward modernity, when the telegraph connected continents and progress was the word on every man's lips. But behind the walls of southern estates, where the air smelled of rot and magnolia, a different story was unfolding, the story of the Beaumont dynasty, a name whispered in river towns, spoken only in half-truths by dock workers and priests who feared the consequences of saying too much. Their plantation was not simply a house of wealth, it was a laboratory of corruption, a place where power was forged not by business, but by pacts. Dark, binding agreements that no man of reason would dare sign. You see, the Beaumonts were not just another wealthy family. They carried something older, something they believed to be older than America itself. A covenant said to have been passed down from Europe, across oceans, hidden within bloodlines and rituals no church dared acknowledge. The whispers said they had made a pact, one that demanded sacrifice, secrecy, and silence. In return, the family never fell from power. Storms destroyed towns, fires consumed villages, epidemics swept through cities, but the Beaumont estate stood untouched, its iron gates gleaming as if mocking the suffering outside. But here is where the unease begins. The children of the Beaumont line were different, not always in appearance, but in presence. Locals swore their eyes carried something unnatural, like candlelight flickering where it should not be. The eldest son was said to speak with voices that weren't his own. Daughters who should have been courted and married vanished, their absence explained away with convenient deaths. Servants reported music in the halls at midnight, though no one touched the piano. This is the kind of story that isn't written in textbooks, but carved into the memory of those who lived in its shadow. It wasn't just a family. It was a dynasty engineered for control, a system of influence that bled into politics, banking, and the church. The question was never if they had power. It was what price they paid to keep it. The deeper you dig into the Beaumont story, the more you realize it wasn't wealth that made them powerful. Wealth was only the mask. Their true strength came from something older, something forbidden. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear the echoes of that system still operating today. Imagine standing before their estate in 1889, the iron gates taller than a man, the house stretching upward like a fortress, its windows always shuttered no matter the season. To outsiders, it looked like just another relic of the Old South, but the Beaumonts weren't preserving tradition. They were guarding a secret rooted in psychological control. Every servant, every visitor, every child raised behind those walls was shaped, molded, conditioned. The family understood something most men never will, that to control others, you don't need chains or whips, you need belief, you need ritual, you need to rewrite reality itself. That is what the Beaumonts perfected. They created an atmosphere so heavy, so oppressive, that those inside stopped questioning. The family gatherings were not dinners, they were ceremonies. The prayers spoken were not to any god you've ever heard of, but to something else, something the family believed had chosen them, marked them. And through these ceremonies they engineered obedience, loyalty, silence. The servants did not speak, the neighbors did not ask, and the authorities looked the other way, because the Beaumonts didn't just own land, they owned minds. There's a reason the story of this dynasty was buried. It wasn't because they lacked importance, it was because they represented the blueprint of control. Think about it. How do governments, corporations, and institutions keep you docile today, not through force, but through psychology, through narratives repeated until you forget they were ever lies, through rituals disguised as traditions, education, or even entertainment? The Beaumonts understood that centuries ago. They didn't invent the system, they simply embodied it, and that's why their estate became a silent fortress of power. But there is a darker layer, one that makes this more than just a story of influence, because those who entered the Beaumont estate often didn't leave whole. Some were broken, psychologically shattered. Others disappeared entirely, and when asked, the family had the same answer: illness, accident, tragedy. Yet no graves could be found, no records were kept, only whispers of screams carried on the night wind. So I ask you, was this simply a family drunk on power, or were they serving something else, something that required those disappearances as offerings, something that demanded a pact, one sealed in silence and blood? And if such a system existed then, are you so sure it doesn't exist now, hidden behind the polished walls of modern institutions? There is something you must understand before we go deeper. Power, real power, is never accidental. It is cultivated generation by generation, like a crop fed by blood instead of water. The Beaumonts understood this truth better than most. Their dynasty was not just a family, it was an institution in itself, an institution that thrived on silence, on the manipulation of perception, and on the slow erosion of individuality. Step inside their estate, and you would notice something uncanny. The walls were lined with portraits of ancestors, their eyes painted with an unsettling precision, as though they followed you through the hall. These portraits were not mere decoration, they were symbols. Every Beaumont child was forced to learn the names, dates, and supposed accomplishments of these figures. But beneath the polished stories of war heroes and wealthy merchants, there were gaps, missing details, omitted truths. It was as though history had been rewritten inside those walls. A false narrative crafted to convince each new generation that their bloodline was not just privileged, but chosen. Think about that for a moment. What happens when a child grows up believing he is chosen, when he is taught that his family is above consequence, above morality, above even the laws of nature? That child doesn't become a man, he becomes an instrument, an extension of the system itself. The Beaumonts raised their heirs not as individuals but as vessels, vessels for a power older than their name, vessels for a pact whose origins no outsider could trace. And yet, the truth always leaks through the cracks. Visitors to the estate reported hearing strange chants carried through the halls at night, lanterns glowing in windows when every candle had supposedly been snuffed out, carriages arriving under the cover of darkness, delivering men who never left by daylight, no records, no explanation. Iron's just the quiet acknowledgement that whatever was happening inside was not meant for common eyes. Now I must warn you, this is where the story starts to shift from disturbing to dangerous, because if the Beaumonts truly believed they were chosen, then who or what was doing the choosing? They claimed it was ancestry, destiny, bloodline, but the rituals suggest otherwise. The whispers of servants suggest otherwise. They speak of symbols carved into the foundation stones of the estate, markings older than Louisiana itself, markings traced back to secret European orders that thrived on control and corruption. The Beaumonts didn't rise by luck. They rose because they were connected. Connected to something bigger, something hidden, something that has survived every empire, every revolution, every collapse. And if you think that's just history, ask yourself why the same symbols appear today, in places of power you walk past every day. Ritual is not what most people think. It isn't robes, candles, and theatrics for the sake of spectacle. Ritual is programming. It is repetition designed to bend the mind until it no longer resists. The Beaumonts understood this with terrifying clarity. Their household was not a home. It was a theater of ritual, where every gesture, every meal, every conversation carried symbolic weight. From childhood, Beaumont heirs were trained in silence. Imagine a dining room where no one spoke unless granted permission by the Patriarch. Imagine children forced to memorize phrases in languages they did not understand, repeating them night after night until the sounds became instinct, like breathing. That is how control begins, not with whips, but with words, not with chains, but with rhythm. The family hosted gatherings cloaked as celebrations. To outsiders, they were masquerades of wealth. Lavish dinners, music echoing across the bayou, champagne poured into crystal glasses. But behind closed doors, the celebration shifted into something else. Candles extinguished, curtains drawn, the laughter silenced. Guests were separated, tested, observed. Those deemed useful were drawn deeper into the fold. Those who resisted often vanished from the record. The Beaumonts weren't entertaining, they were recruiting, binding men of influence into their orbit through ritual humiliation, whispered secrets, and psychological manipulation that ensured silence. But here's the darker truth. Ritual wasn't only for control of others, it was for control of the self. The patriarchs of the dynasty believed that identity itself could be broken, reshaped, reforged, and so their heirs were subjected to ordeals, days without food, nights without sleep, isolation in hidden chambers beneath the estate. If a child broke under the strain, they were cast aside, declared unworthy. If they endured, they emerged, Chanburn, Jed, emptied of resistance, filled only with the family's will. This is where the whispers of an unholy pact resurface, because the conditioning was not merely practical, it carried a spiritual undercurrent. Symbols carved into walls, prayers uttered in forgotten tongues, blood spilled in ways too precise to be accident. The servants said these were offerings, the family said they were tradition, but the effect was the same. The rituals created vessels, human instruments ready to carry the weight of a dynasty that believed itself eternal. Now stop and think. What if ritual hasn't vanished? What if it has simply changed its mask? You see it in corporate oaths, in military drills, in political ceremonies broadcast to millions. Do you think it's coincidence, or do you recognize the same blueprint, the same system the Beaumonts wielded to shape their heirs, now scaled across entire nations? Every dynasty has a cornerstone, something it rests upon. For the Beaumonts, it wasn't land, wealth, or politics. It was the pact, the unholy agreement whispered about for generations, but never spoken aloud. The closer you look, the more you see its fingerprints on every decision the family made. What was this pact? Legends differ, but the pattern is clear. The Beaumonts promised something in exchange for influence, immunity, and survival. Some claimed it was blood, a life taken for every generation to secure prosperity. Others believed it was obedience, that the family swore to serve a force older than the nation itself, older than Christianity, older even than recorded history. But one truth was undeniable. The Beaumonts did not rise naturally. Their rise was engineered, guaranteed by something no ordinary man could summon. Records from the time speak of Beaumont heirs who should have died from disease, yet recovered overnight. Business ventures that should have collapsed in ruin, yet flourished without explanation. Rivals who opposed them politically found themselves bankrupt, disgraced, or dead within months. Too many coincidences, too many convenient tragedies. And there was always the silence. Whenever a child in the family died young, no public mourning was permitted. Funerals were closed, coffins were sealed. The servants whispered of strange gatherings beneath the estate, torches flickering through cracks in the earth. Was this grief, or was it payment? Was each illness the settling of a debt? The real horror lies not in the possibility of a pact, but in the idea that it worked. Because generation after generation the Beaumonts thrived, and their estate became more than a home. It became a temple. Beneath its foundations were hidden chambers carved in stone where rituals were carried out away from prying eyes. What was spoken there has been lost, but the symbols remain, etched deep into the walls, symbols that match carvings found in European cathedrals, Masonic lodges, and even the ruins of civilizations long extinct. Now listen closely. Power does not come without cost. That is the law of every empire, every throne, every secret order. And the Beaumonts understood that law. They paid willingly. The question is, what was taken in return? Was it their children, their humanity, their souls? Or did the pact demand something more terrible, something that echoes still through the corridors of power today? You've been told that history is a story of progress, of enlightenment, of freedom, but what if history is just a record of pacts? Families, dynasties, governments, each trading something sacred for something lasting. And what if the Beaumonts were not an anomaly, but a mirror of the very system we live in now? The story of the Beaumonts would be chilling enough if it remained trapped inside their Louisiana estate. But it didn't. The pact didn't bind only their bloodline. It rippled outward into the veins of the nation itself. Because what good is power if it remains confined to a single family? To endure, it must expand. And expand it did. By the late 1800s, members of the Beaumont family had quietly moved beyond their plantation walls. Some entered politics, securing seats in local government. Others slid into banking, manipulating debts and credits that controlled entire communities. And a select few penetrated the church, not as men of faith, but as men of influence, twisting the pulpit into another instrument of control. Step by step, the pact infiltrated institutions designed to protect the public. The The Beaumonts didn't seize power with armies, they wove themselves into the very fabric of authority. Here's the disturbing truth. Institutions are the perfect hiding place. A man can disappear, but a system endures, and once a family embeds itself within law, finance, and religion, their reach extends beyond generations. The Beaumonts understood this perfectly. Their dynasty was not built to be admired, it was built to be obeyed. Consider this. Documents from the 1890s show sudden spikes in funding to Beaumont-controlled banks, just as local politicians, many indebted to those same banks, passed laws that favored their holdings. Court cases against the family vanished. Witnesses retracted statements or vanished altogether, and newspapers that dared to publish exposés suddenly collapsed from financial strain. Do you see the pattern? The family was untouchable not because of wealth, but because they had weaponized the very institutions meant to hold men accountable. But the question remains, what kept them loyal to the pact? Why did they guard it so ruthlessly? The answer, mate, I lie in the whispers of psychological conditioning, not just within the family, but extended outward. Those who crossed paths with the Beaumonts, politicians, priests, merchants, were often invited to gatherings at the estate. What they experienced there was never spoken aloud, but after those nights they never disobeyed. They voted in line, they preached in line, they spent in line. One by one, their will was bent, reshaped, subdued, not with threats of violence, but with the quiet weight of ritual. Now pause for a moment and look at the world around you. Do you believe institutions are neutral? Do you believe governments, corporations, and churches operate independently? Or do you see the same design, the same blueprint that began in families like the Beaumonts? Power hidden in plain sight, control disguised as tradition, ritual reborn as policy. The dynasty was never meant to remain local. It was a seed, and its roots grew deep into the American foundation. Fear is the oldest form of control. Long before governments raised armies, long before kings built thrones, fear ruled men's hearts. The Beaumonts understood this better than most. They did not need to raise a sword or fire a shot. They only needed to remind people of the cost of defiance. In Louisiana, whispers about the family spread like fog. Children were told not to wander near their estate. Workers who spoke too freely about what they saw at the docks were never seen again. Entire towns grew quiet when their name was mentioned. This was not coincidence, it was design. Fear was cultivated like a crop, planted in rumor, watered in silence, harvested in obedience. But the Beaumonts went further. They learned to make fear personal. Servants inside the estate reported small, deliberate acts meant to unsettle. Mirrors covered in cloth, doors opening at night without a breeze, strange markings appearing on bedroom walls. Whether these events were staged or supernatural hardly mattered. The effect was the same. Those within the estate lived in a constant state of unease, and when a man is made to feel he is always watched, always vulnerable, his will breaks faster than any chain could. The family also used spectacle. On certain nights, torches lit the grounds as masked figures walked in silence across the estate, their faces hidden, their voices low. Was it ceremony? Was it intimidation? To the witnesses, it didn't matter. The images lingered in their minds, vivid and haunting. Even if no violence was done, the memory itself was a prison. Now consider this. Fear doesn't only control the powerless, it controls the powerful. A politician who benefits from Beaumont support also fears losing it. A banker who owes them debts fears default. A priest who accepts their donations fears exposure. Everyone was bound, not by visible chains, but by invisible threads of dread. His blueprint did not die with the Beaumonts. Look at the world today. Fear is still the tool of choice. Media saturates you with images of danger. Governments repeat narratives of threats, crises, enemies. Corporations remind you of what you lack, what you could lose, and you obey, not because you are chained, but because you are afraid. The family's legacy is alive every time fear is used to bend a population into silence. The Beaumont dynasty did not just inherit wealth, they inherited the secret that fear, carefully crafted, can control generations. And if you're honest with yourself, you already know, you're living in that system now. The deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. Your entire perception of freedom has been scripted. You've been given choices that were never real, presented with paths that all lead to the same destination. Every ballot, every law, every institution has been designed not to liberate you, but to contain you. The prison without walls is more effective than the one built of stone, because the captive believes he is free, and that belief makes him obedient, that belief makes him blind. Think of how easily symbols are used against you. A flag waves, a song plays, and suddenly men are willing to die for men they will never meet. Wars are fought, lives are ruined, empires are expanded, and yet the pawns cheer their own sacrifice. This is not patriotism, this is programming. Ancient orders understood that if you could control symbols, you could control thought. A lion on a banner once inspired armies. A cross carved into stone once dictated the lives of millions. And today, corporate logos and political slogans guide your behavior in exactly the same way. The methods never changed, only the masks. Look deeper into the rituals around you. School is not education, it is initiation. The ringing of a bell, the lining up of bodies, the pledge to a flag. These are not accidents, they are rehearsals. The system trains you early to obey signals, to follow commands, to stand, to sit, to speak when spoken to, and you grow into an adult who doesn't question authority because obedience has been sewn into your bones. The greatest lie ever told is that conformity is safety. In truth, it is the slow death of the spirit. The ancient priests knew this. They whispered to kings and emperors, "Control the myth, and you control the people." Religion and governance were never truly separate. One sanctified the other. One commanded fear of gods, the other commanded fear of punishment. Together they forged an unbreakable chain around the minds of men, and those chains still bind you. You may call them laws, norms, or tradition, but they serve the same purpose, to keep you small while those above you remain untouchable. Ask yourself, why is rebellion always punished more harshly than crime? Because rebellion threatens the illusion. A thief steals gold, but a rebel steals power, and power is the one thing the elites cannot afford to lose. That is why every revolution you've ever read about was either crushed, infiltrated, or eventually steered back into the hands of those very same elites. Even resistance is a game they have learned to control. You are not being guided toward truth. You are being herded into belief. Every story, every headline, every history book is crafted with one goal, to keep you asleep. And the more you sleep, the less you see the strings pulling at your every move. By the autumn of 1888, the Whitlock name had become synonymous with dread. Travelers who passed through the mountains spoke in hushed tones of a family plagued by strange deformities, sudden bursts of violence, and deaths that defied explanation. Rumors spread like wildfire that the Whitlocks had struck some infernal bargain generations ago, trading their humanity for unnatural survival. But what was whispered in nearby towns barely scratched the surface of the nightmare festering in the Whitlock cabin. Children born to the family came into the world frail and twisted, their cries shrill and piercing, echoing through the night like the wails of tortured souls. Neighbors who once pitied them began to shun them entirely, believing the land itself had grown cursed. Crops withered around their property, animals grew sick, and the forest seemed unnaturally silent whenever one approached their homestead. By the end of the year, sickness swept through the family. Strange fevers gripped them, leaving blackened veins that pulsed beneath their skin. Some Whitlocks claimed to see visions of shadowy figures standing in the corners of their rooms, whispering secrets in a language no one could understand. Others became violent, lashing out at kin with inhuman strength, their eyes glazed as though another will had taken hold of them. One night, a fire broke out in the Whitlock cabin. Townsfolk who saw the flames from the valley rushed toward the blaze, but by the time they arrived, the structure had collapsed into smoldering ruin. Strangely, no bodies were ever found in the ashes. Some claimed the family had perished together in the inferno, their curse finally consuming them. Others swore they saw figures moving in the tree line that night, dark silhouettes slipping into the forest, carrying with them the same screams that had haunted Appalachia for years. The Whitlock family was never seen in full again, yet their legend refused to die. Travelers through the Appalachian wilderness would later report glimpses of gaunt, pale figures watching them from the shadows. A few unlucky souls vanished entirely, their campsites discovered days later, torn apart as though by wild beasts. Each disappearance was eventually blamed on the Whitlock curse, fueling generations of fear. By the turn of the century, the Whitlocks had become less of a family and more of a myth, a chilling tale mothers told their children to keep them from wandering into the woods at night. But for those who had heard the screams, seen the shadows, or walked past the ruins of that cursed cabin, one truth remained unshakable. The Whitlock curse had not ended, it had only begun to spread. By the winter of 1889, the Holloway clan's notoriety had stretched far beyond the quiet Kentucky hills. Whispers about their deformities, unnatural strength and strange habits made their way into medical circles. That year, a young physician named Dr. Samuel Whittaker traveled from Louisville to the Holloway settlement. He was drawn not by curiosity alone, but by the promise of scientific discovery. Whittaker had heard reports of the Holloway's peculiar traits: extra digits, misshapen jaws, unusually pale eyes that glowed under the lantern light, and a family tree so entangled it seemed to defy natural law. As a man of medicine, he believed the family could unlock secrets about heredity, knowledge that might propel his career into fame. When he arrived, however, he was struck less by scientific intrigue and more by an oppressive sense of dread. The Holloway homestead stood in a valley where the mist never seemed to lift, clinging to the crooked fences and warped wooden houses. Children with elongated limbs watched him silently from the tree line. Their faces bore expressions too knowing for their years. Inside the Holloway house, he met Matriarch Eliza Holloway, whose age was impossible to determine. Her skin sagged like wax, but her eyes burned with unnatural clarity. She welcomed him with a rasping voice, speaking as though she had been expecting him. "You've come to see what God cursed and the devil claimed," she said, placing a bony hand on his arm. Over the following weeks, Whittaker kept meticulous notes. He observed the Holloway children, some unable to speak but capable of guttural shrieks that rattled the walls, others who displayed strange bursts of intelligence before lapsing into violent fits. He documented their physical abnormalities and family history, tracing back generations of isolation and intermarriage, but the deeper he dug, the more he felt walked. Head. Holloway men followed him into the woods when he collected plants for study. Their shadows lingered at his cabin door at night. On one occasion he awoke to find one of the Holloway boys standing at the foot of his bed, eyes unblinking, a grin stretched too wide across his face. Whittaker's writings grew frantic. He noted that while many Holloways were sickly, some were disturbingly strong, able to lift weights far beyond their frame. He also described what he believed were shared hallucinations among the family, visions of a tall man with hollow eyes who came to them in dreams. By spring, Dr. Whittaker vanished. His journal, discovered years later, was the only trace of his work. It ended with a chilling line: "They are not merely a family, they are something older, something waiting." As the generations of the Holloway family moved into the early 20th century, their name began to scatter like dust in the Montana wind. Some branches of the family tree faded into obscurity, while others carried the weight of the Holloway curse, like a mark etched into their very blood. Yet, something strange began to occur. Records of certain Holloway descendants suddenly disappeared. Census reports listed them, then erased them. Local registries noted births, only for the names to vanish without explanation. Entire family units seemed to dissolve into thin air, leaving behind only whispers of their existence. Neighbors in the surrounding areas began to murmur about the Holloway vanishings. Stories spread of children who were born with unusual features, eyes too wide, limbs oddly proportioned, who were never seen again after their first birthdays. Families claimed the Holloways were hiding their malformed heirs deep within their crumbling homestead, feeding the rumors of grotesque genetics passed down through generations of isolation. Some suggested the heirs were not hidden at all, but instead taken, spirited away by government agents who had grown interested in the Holloway bloodline. The US had just entered a period of scientific curiosity around eugenics and genetic studies. Rumors began to circulate that doctors from the East had quietly visited Montana, paying the Holloways for access to their unique stock. Locals told tales of shadowy men with briefcases arriving in the dead of night, leaving hours later with strange crates and unsettling silence. The thought that the Holloways might have been used as subjects in early unethical experiments was enough to send chills down the spine of anyone who dared speak their name aloud. But there was another, more sinister theory whispered in taverns and around campfires, that the Holloways themselves were erasing the heirs. Whenever a child was born too different, too twisted by whatever haunted their bloodline, the family simply removed them. Some claimed the land itself was hungry, that the abandoned barns and root cellars beneath the Holloway estate became burial grounds for children whose existence was too disturbing to acknowledge. By the 1920s, the Holloway name had become a ghost. No one knew how many heirs still lived, or if the family line had truly ended. Yet, every so often, a pale stranger would arrive in town, asking quiet questions, their face bearing the unmistakable mark of Holloway blood. It was as if the family had not died out at all, but instead retreated into the shadows, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The question lingered over Montana like a curse. Had the Holloway family truly vanished, or were their heirs still among us, hidden in plain sight? The funeral home on the outskirts of the quiet Pennsylvania town was more than just a place where bodies were prepared for burial. By 1825, whispers had already begun to circulate that the family who owned it did not treat the dead with the dignity expected in Christian communities. At night, strange candlelight flickered through the boarded windows, and townsfolk swore they heard hymns twisted into chants that bore no resemblance to Holy Scripture. Rumors of rituals began to spread, claiming that the family performed dark ceremonies with the bodies entrusted to them. In this section of the story, the macabre details of those rituals emerge. Neighbors claimed to see shallow pits dug behind the home, filled with half-burned remains that suggested neither a proper cremation nor burial. The family would gather in the basement, their shadows thrown tall against stone walls by the glow of oil lamps. What they did there remains speculative, but some believed they were invoking old-world superstitions, merging pagan rites with their funerary work. Children who dared sneak close spoke of grotesque effigies made from bones and funeral cloths, tied together with twine and hung from the rafters. Such stories were dismissed at first as childish exaggerations, but with each passing year, more and more bodies went missing, and families began to whisper that their loved ones had not been laid to rest at all. Instead, they had become part of the rituals behind closed doors. The image of the funeral home as a sanctuary of grief, twisted into a den of secrecy and horror, spread like wildfire. This section reveals the shift in perception. The community no longer saw the family as mere undertakers, but as something far darker. The rituals represented a breaking of sacred trust, turning mourning into exploitation. It was here that fear began to outweigh doubt, and suspicion hardened into something that could not be ignored. By the mid-1820s, the funeral home's reputation had already grown grim, but the disappearance of several local orphans pushed the community into paranoia. The town's orphanage, a modest wooden building run by a strict matron, was a vulnerable place where children often slipped into obscurity. When 3 orphans vanished without a trace, all eyes turned toward the funeral home. The family had offered to take in children from time to time, claiming they needed help with chores. On the surface, it appeared charitable, but villagers soon whispered that the children never returned. The orphans had been last seen carrying buckets of water toward the funeral home, and then nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and no trace was found. The matron insisted she had handed them over with signed papers, but the records mysteriously disappeared, leaving only her testimony against the family's denial. Speculation swirled that the children had become part of the twisted practices already rumored to take place in the basement. Perhaps they were witnesses to something unspeakable and silenced forever. Others whispered darker theories, that the family had grown obsessed with the vitality of youth and sought to use the children in their rituals. This was the turning point where unease evolved into terror. Parents forbade their children from going near the funeral home. Mothers clutched their little ones tighter during church sermons. The vanishing of the orphans was more than tragedy. It was evidence of predation. For the first time, the community began speaking openly of evil. A place once associated with grief and burial had become, in their minds, a feeding ground for something monstrous. As suspicions deepened, the rumors grew more grotesque. It was no longer enough to accuse the family of theft or unholy rituals. Whispers began to emerge that they had crossed the darkest line of all, cannibalism. In a time of poor harvests and harsh winters, such an accusation carried chilling plausibility. Families struggling to feed themselves found it horrifyingly easy to believe that the undertakers, already surrounded by corpses, might have taken desperate measures that evolved into perverse habits. Farmers claimed they saw the family butchering meat late at night, but no livestock was ever accounted for. A traveling merchant swore he had been served stew at their table that tasted unlike any beef or pork he had known. Skeptics dismissed such tales as exaggerations born of fear, but the idea stuck, and soon it became part of local legend. The family not only killed, but consumed their victims. The theory of cannibalism was fueled further when half-buried remains were found behind the funeral home, gnawed and broken in unnatural ways. Dogs dug up bones, but these were not simply discarded after burial. They bore marks that resembled teeth. Was it possible? The horror of the question spread, and the funeral home was no longer just feared, but reviled. This section explores how rumor evolved into myth, but also how myth became a tool of justice. With little evidence, the accusations of cannibalism might never have stood in court, but in the minds of the community, they justified any action against the family. By now, they were no longer undertakers. They were predators, ghouls, a family of monsters in human skin. The first missing persons reports in Millfield were dismissed as unfortunate accidents. Travelers often vanished on the road, prey to bandits, wild animals, or the treacherous wilderness itself. But by the late 1820s, the pattern was undeniable. Too many people were disappearing, and always near the same place, the outskirts of Millfield, where the Whitlock funeral home loomed like a sentinel of death. Farmhands who left for work never returned. A peddler selling goods in town vanished after being seen speaking with Robert Whitlock. A young woman traveling to visit family was last spotted walking past the funeral home at dusk. Each disappearance left a void, a family grieving without answers. Yet there was never any trace of struggle, no bodies discovered in the woods or rivers. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The townsfolk began to whisper, their suspicions muted by fear. Some claimed to have heard screams in the night, carried on the wind from the direction of the funeral home. Others spoke of seeing strange lantern lights flickering in the cellar windows long after midnight, shadows moving within when the rest of Millfield slept. A few even swore they had caught the smell of burning flesh on the wind, though no fire was ever seen. Yet no one dared to confront the Whitlocks directly. Their reputation as undertakers, combined with their solemn presence at nearly every funeral, made them untouchable. They were seen as pillars of the community, even as whispers painted them as something else entirely. Fear kept the townsfolk silent. Fear of being ridiculed, fear of being wrong, and fear of becoming the next to vanish. The disappearances continued, building like a storm on the horizon. Each missing person became another secret buried within the walls of the funeral home, another chapter in a growing legacy of horror. Millfield was slowly dying, not from disease or famine, but from the invisible hand of a family who had made death their craft. By the time outsiders began to take notice, it was already too late. The Whitlocks had perfected their methods, leaving behind no witnesses, no survivors, only coffins filled with secrets and a town haunted by its silence. Despite mounting suspicions, the family remained untouched by the law for years. Why? The answer lay in a conspiracy of silence that wrapped the town like a suffocating shroud. The undertakers were not poor, and whispers suggested they had bought the loyalty of local officials. Some claimed the sheriff received free services for his kin. Others said the family supplied the town council with bribes. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. No matter how many disappearances or bones were uncovered, the family was never investigated. The funeral home had become a place of whispered dread, but it also served a necessary function. Death was constant in 1825 Pennsylvania. Plagues, accidents, and poverty ensured there was always work for undertakers. The town needed them, even if it feared them. Thus, the conspiracy of silence was not simply corruption, but also convenience. To accuse the family was to risk destabilizing the fragile balance of grief and survival in the community. But silence breeds complicity. As the town ignored the signs, more lives were claimed. Families grew wary of reporting missing loved ones, fearing it would draw the attention of those who thrived on grief. The funeral home stood untouched, a grim landmark of both fear and necessity. The conspiracy of silence, more than anything else, allowed the horrors to continue unchecked. It was here that the true tragedy unfolded, not just in the family's deeds, but in the town's unwillingness to confront them. The courtroom in Harrisburg was packed beyond capacity, a suffocating mixture of morbid curiosity and righteous anger lingering in the air. The funeral home family had become infamous across the state. Newspapers printed lurid headlines that labeled them the undertakers of death. Every seat was filled, and people even stood in aisles and corridors just to glimpse the monsters who had once been trusted with the bodies of loved ones. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It was theater, a dark performance in which the curtain lifted on the sins of an entire bloodline. The family members, dressed in somber black attire, sat at the defense table with cold, unfeeling expressions. Their lack of remorse chilled those who attended. Witness after witness took the stand, their testimonies a relentless hammer striking against the fragile facade the family tried to maintain. Former employees of the funeral home spoke of midnight burials with no records, of bodies vanishing from the embalming room, of muffled cries in the cellar. Some wept openly as they recounted the horrors they had witnessed, but were too afraid to report. The most damning testimony came from a young gravedigger who claimed to have seen the family matriarch leading a procession into the woods, her children carrying lanterns and dragging heavy sacks. The boy's voice shook as he described the sounds of shovels striking dirt and the faint whimpers that came from the sacks before they were silenced forever. The courtroom was frozen in horror, and the jury, their faces pale, could hardly meet the family's eyes. Prosecutors painted a picture of a dynasty corrupted by bloodlust, one that had hidden behind the guise of a funeral home to mask their atrocities. They spoke not only of murder but of ritual, of death celebrated rather than mourned. The defense attempted to claim madness, insisting that a generational curse had clouded their minds, but the evidence was too overwhelming. When the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of cheers and sobs. Yet even then the family remained unmoved. The matriarch leaned forward, her lips curling into the faintest smile, and whispered something to her children that no one else could hear. It was not the reaction of a defeated soul, but of someone who believed that the true legacy of her bloodline could not be extinguished by mere law. The trial may have ended, but the whispers of the curse continued to haunt Pennsylvania. Dawn broke cold and grey over the prison yard where the gallows had been erected. Crowds gathered once again, this time not to watch justice debated, but to see it carried out. The execution of the funeral home family was to be public, a grim spectacle meant to bring closure to the community. Yet as the condemned were led to the scaffold, an uneasy silence fell upon the crowd. The family walked with unnerving composure, their black-clad figures resembling mourners at their own funeral. One by one, the children were brought forward. Their faces betrayed no fear, only the same chilling emptiness that had followed them throughout the trial. Some in the crowd shouted curses, demanding tears, begging for signs of regret. None came. The matriarch was last to ascend, her frail form belying the monstrous legacy she had built. She turned to the crowd with eyes that seemed to pierce through every soul present and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. "You may end our lives today, but you cannot bury what we have become. Death is not our punishment. It is our return." The hangman, visibly shaken, placed the noose around her neck. A prayer was muttered, the lever pulled, and with a sickening crack, the reign of terror appeared to end. The bodies hung still against the morning sky, swaying slightly in the breeze. The crowd dispersed slowly, some with satisfaction, others with unease, as if they sensed something had not truly ended. For weeks after, rumors spread that the prison guards heard voices at night, faint whispers echoing through the corridors where the condemned had spent their final hours. Farmers swore that the ground beneath the gallows refused to grow grass, as though poisoned by something that lingered in the soil. Some claimed to see the silhouettes of the family walking along the cemetery road at dusk, lanterns in hand, searching for the graves they had never found. Filling. The executions provided justice in a legal sense, but they did not ease the sense of dread that clung to the community. Instead, a darker legend began to take root, one that suggested the family had achieved exactly what they desired: immortality, not in body, but in fear. Even after the nooses had tightened and the bodies were lowered into unmarked graves, the funeral home remained a blight upon Pennsylvania soil. Abandoned yet never truly silent, it became a place of pilgrimage for the curious and the damned alike. Windows shattered, floorboards rotted, but the walls seemed to hum with an energy that defied decay. Local children dared one another to step inside, swearing they heard footsteps following them or doors slamming shut when no wind blew. Some never returned. Families moving into nearby homes often reported unnatural occurrences: candles extinguishing on their own, photographs falling from walls, and the scent of rot filling their kitchens at night. Farmers complained of livestock found dead without cause, their bodies laid out with ceremonial precision that mirrored the family's rumored rituals. Each incident deepened the belief that the curse of the funeral home family was far from broken. Generations passed, but the tale was never forgotten. The story of the Pennsylvania undertakers became a warning passed down from parents to children. Never wander too close to the funeral home, never follow strange lantern lights in the woods, never listen to the whispers at your window after midnight. The family had become myth, their true history buried beneath folklore, yet every retelling carried the same chill that their trial once inspired. Occasionally, outsiders would attempt to purchase the ruined property, dreaming of rebuilding it into a business or home. Each time something drove them away, accidents, sickness, or sudden madness. The land seemed cursed, refusing to allow peace or prosperity to grow upon it. Paranormal investigators filmed strange lights, captured disembodied voices, and reported being touched by unseen hands. Their evidence fueled the legend further, convincing many that the funeral home was more than it was alive. The haunting legacy of the family was not confined to one house or one town. It spread like a shadow, whispered in every corner of Pennsylvania, shaping the region's identity. To speak of death was to speak of them, and to bury a loved one was to pray that no echo of their darkness would taint the grave. In death, they had achieved a power greater than they ever held in life. The tale of the funeral home family is one that lingers, not just in history books, but in the very air of Pennsylvania's countryside. More than a century has passed since their trial and execution, yet their story continues to unsettle even the most skeptical minds. Travelers passing through the region often remark on an oppressive weight in the atmosphere, as though the earth itself remembers what happened there. Some claim that on fog-heavy nights, if you wander too close to the ruins of the funeral home, you will hear the faint toll of a bell, though no bell remains. Others insist that if you light a lantern and walk into the woods at midnight, shadowy figures will appear to guide you deeper, their voices coaxing you toward an unseen grave. Those foolish enough to follow never return. Historians debate how much of the tale is truth and how much is legend, yet the line has long since blurred. The documented trial and execution are undeniable, but the stories that grew in their aftermath are what give the family immortality. Perhaps that was always their goal, not to escape justice, but to ensure their names were never forgotten. Today, the funeral home stands in ruins, its charred walls and collapsing roof a monument to horror. Yet no matter how decayed it becomes, no one dares demolish it. The locals say to destroy the house would be to release what still lingers inside, and so it remains, a grim reminder of Pennsylvania's darkest chapter. The story ends where it began, with whispers. Whispers of death, whispers of ritual, whispers of a family that turned grief into terror. And when the night grows still and the wind brushes against the old cemetery gates, some swear the whispers begin again, carried through the trees, reminding the living that the dead never truly rest. The funeral home family may have been executed in 1825, but their story, like their curse, endures.